March 1901. A cottage on Cape Cod. A woman sits at a bedside holding the hand of a friend she is poisoning, and everyone in that house calls her Jolly Jane. Nobody suspects her, because nobody is looking. Only 1 in 6 American serial killers is a woman. These 10 are credited with over 150 deaths. Section 1. Jane Topham Honora Kelly was born in Boston in the middle of the 1850s, into the poorest part of a city that had absorbed an enormous number of Irish famine immigrants and had little idea what to do with them. Her father, Peter Kelly, worked as a tailor and was known around the neighborhood by a nickname that referred to his mental state rather than his trade. Her mother died of tuberculosis while Honora was small, leaving 4 daughters in a household run by a man whose behavior was already the subject of local talk. The 2 eldest were placed elsewhere. That left Honora and her sister Delia, and in 1863, Peter Kelly delivered both of them to the Boston Female Asylum and left them there. One of the sisters was committed to an asylum in adulthood. The asylum was not an orphanage in the modern sense, and the girls in it were not waiting to be adopted. It was a placement institution, and its purpose was to take destitute girls off the street and move them into private homes as indentured servants. A family would apply, agree to feed and clothe, and minimally educate the child, and receive her labor until she turned 18. The arrangement was legal, common, and regarded at the time as charity. What it produced in practice was a class of children who lived inside respectable households without belonging to them, doing the work of a servant while being told they were fortunate. Honora was placed with Mrs. Anne C. Topham of Lowell, Massachusetts, at around 8 years old. She took the name Jane Topham and used it for the rest of her life. She was never adopted. The distinction mattered in every practical way. She grew up in the house alongside Anne Topham's own daughter, Elizabeth, went to school, learned to sew, and was reminded of what she was by the terms of the arrangement itself. When Anne Topham died, the estate went to Elizabeth. Jane received a small sum and stayed on in the house as help. By her 30s, she had an engagement that ended when the man married someone else, and she had begun building the personality that people would later describe with a certain amount of confusion. She was talkative, funny, physically warm, and generous with gossip. People enjoyed her company and repeated her stories. The nickname Jolly Jane came out of that period and stuck to her through everything that followed, which is part of why the case is remembered at all. In 1885, she entered nurse training at Cambridge Hospital in Massachusetts. American nursing in that decade was in the middle of turning itself into a profession. Formal training schools attached to hospitals had only existed in the country since the 1870s, modelled loosely on the English system, and they ran on a specific bargain. Students provided the hospital with unpaid labour for 2 or 3 years in exchange for instruction and a certificate. There was no state licensing, no registration board, and no mechanism by which one hospital could learn what a nurse had done at another. A student nurse on a night ward had access to the drug cabinet, control of the medication record, and almost no supervision after the physicians went home. Topham used all 3. She began altering the doses of morphine and atropine given to patients on her wards, sometimes increasing them, sometimes withholding them, and recording in the ward book whatever she wanted the record to say. The choice of those 2 drugs is what kept it hidden. Morphine in overdose produces one unmistakable sign, which is pinpoint pupils, and any physician of the period would have recognized it. Atropine does the opposite and blows the pupils wide. Given together, the pupils can look close to normal while the patient dies. Whether Topham understood the interaction as a chemist would, or arrived at it by watching what happened, she used the combination for the rest of her career, and it defeated bedside diagnosis for roughly 16 years. Patients on those wards also had no way to complain about her, and that is not incidental. A hospital ward in Boston in 1887 held people who were poor because anyone with money was treated at home. The patients were charity cases, and the relationship between a charity patient and the nursing staff was not one in which a complaint about a dose would have travelled anywhere. Several of the people she experimented on recovered and were discharged, and none of them ever appeared in the record again. Cambridge Hospital dismissed her before she completed the program, over the deaths on her wards, and over the records that did not match what physicians had ordered. She was hired at Massachusetts General Hospital and dismissed from there as well. Neither institution reported her to anyone, because there was nobody to report her to. She set herself up as a private duty nurse and began taking work in people's homes. Private duty nursing removed the last constraint on her. A private nurse in that period was hired directly by a family, moved into the house, and had complete authority over the sick room. She controlled the medication, the food, the visitors, and the information the family received about the patient's condition. No physician was present most of the day. No colleague saw the drug cabinet. When a chronically ill person in their 60s or 70s died in bed under the care of a nurse everybody liked, the death certificate wrote itself, and Toppen was skilled enough at the actual work that families recommended her to one another. She had references. She was in demand. The deaths she later admitted to run from the late 1880s onward, and the pattern in them is not the pattern of someone concealing a financial motive. In 1895, she killed her landlord, Israel Dunham. In 1897, she killed his wife, Lovey. In 1899, she killed Elizabeth Brigham, the foster sister she had grown up alongside, using strychnine mixed into mineral water at a summer house, and by her own later account she lay down on the bed and held her while she died. In the summer of 1901, she was renting a cottage on the property of the Davis family in Cataumet, on Cape Cod, and owed them money for it. Alden Davis and his wife Mattie ran the place and had 2 grown daughters, Genevieve and Mary. Mattie Davis travelled to Cambridge at the end of June to collect the unpaid rent, fell ill at Toppen's lodgings, and died there on July 4th. Toppen accompanied the body back to Cataumet and stayed on to help the grieving family, which is how she came to be nursing all of them. Genevieve Gordon died at the end of July. Alden Davis died on August 8th. Mary Gibbs died on August 19th. Within 6 weeks, a family of 4 was reduced to 1 surviving daughter, in a small coastal village where everybody knew everybody, and the woman who had cared for each of them in turn was the same woman in every case. The thing that ended it was a father who refused to accept the explanation. Mary Gibbs was married to a sea captain's son, and her father-in-law, Captain Paul Gibbs, did not believe that a healthy young woman had died of exhaustion and heart failure in a house where 2 other people had just died the same way. He pressed for a toxicological examination. The remains went to Edward S. Wood, the state toxicologist at Harvard Medical School, whose laboratory had been the standard reference for poisoning cases in Massachusetts for years. Wood found morphine and atropine. Cataumet is why this ended at all, and the answer is size. It was a village on the Bourne side of Cape Cod, with a few hundred residents, a summer trade, and a social life in which a family of 4 dying in 6 weeks was not a statistic, but a subject of conversation at every doorstep. In a city, those 4 deaths would have been certified by 4 different physicians and filed in 4 different places. In Cataumet, they were the same house, the same undertaker, the same nurse, and the same neighbours watching her walk to the store. There was a financial thread running through it as well, and it is worth stating without overstating it. Toppen owed the Davis family rent on the cottage, which is what brought Mattie Davis to Cambridge in the first place. After Alden Davis died, she moved into the Davis home and took over the running of it, and questions were raised afterward about paperwork relating to that debt. None of it accounts for the scale of what she had already done over 16 years, and no account of this case has ever managed to build a money motive that covers more than a handful of the deaths. The scientific work was done at Harvard. Alkaloid poisons like morphine and atropine are not detected by the tests that made 19th century arsenic prosecutions possible, because they are organic compounds present in tiny quantities rather than metals that survive indefinitely. Recovering them required a laborious chemical extraction from tissue, and there were few laboratories in the United States capable of doing it and standing behind the result in a courtroom. Edward Wood's laboratory was one of them, and his findings on the Davis exhumations are what turned a village suspicion into a warrant. Massachusetts also had a district attorney willing to act on a body that had been in the ground, which was not a given. Exhumation required an order, the family's cooperation, and a reason, and Captain Paul Gibbs supplied the pressure that produced all 3. Toppen was arrested on October 29, 1901, at a boarding house in Amherst, New Hampshire, and charged initially with the murder of Mary Gibbs. What followed was one of the more unusual confessions in American criminal history. Speaking to her defense attorney, James Stewart Murphy, she admitted to 31 killings, described how she had selected patients, and gave an account of her motive that had nothing to do with money or grievance. She said she took pleasure in it, physical and emotional, and she described a wish to have killed more helpless people than any person who had ever lived. She had climbed into bed with several of the dying and held them. The trial was held at Barnstable in June 1902 and lasted a single day. The defense did not contest that she had administered the poison. 2 physicians examined her for the state, and both concluded she was insane, and the jury took less than half an hour to return a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to the Taunton Insane Hospital in Massachusetts. She lived there for 36 years and died on August 17, 1938, at around 84 years old. Two parts of this case need to be labelled for what they are. The figure of 31 comes from her own confession to her own lawyer and was never tested in a courtroom, because the trial ran on a single count and ended in an insanity finding. Some of those deaths were verified afterward by exhumation, and some were not, which means the true number is unknown in both directions. The claim that she took erotic pleasure in the deaths also comes from her and from a press environment in 1902 that found it irresistible, and it has been repeated ever since without any independent basis beyond her word. What is established is the mechanism, which is why her name still appears in nursing ethics material. She was fired from 2 teaching hospitals for exactly the conduct that later killed people, and both institutions handled it by removing her from the building. There was no license to revoke, no registry to flag her in, and no obligation on either hospital to warn the next employer or the families who would hire her privately. Massachusetts introduced nurse registration in 1910, 9 years after her arrest, and the rest of the country followed over the following 2 decades. The insanity finding also fed a legal argument that ran through American courts for the following 30 years. The 2 physicians who examined her described a condition the period called moral insanity, meaning an intact intellect combined with an absent conscience. And the Barnstable verdict is cited as one of the clearest early American applications of it. Modern psychiatry does not use the term, and the diagnostic categories that replaced it are contested in their own right. What the verdict did in practice was remove her from the ordinary criminal system entirely, which meant no sentencing, no appeal, and no further inquiry into the other 30 deaths she had described. The confession went into a lawyer's file, and the state stopped asking. Elizabeth Brigham's husband, Orrin, had also been given a dose by Toppin and survived it. She had wanted to marry him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 7 years later, on a farm in northern Indiana, a fire burned a farmhouse to the ground with 4 bodies inside. 3 were children. The 4th was an adult woman who had been decapitated, and when they measured her, she was 5 inches too short and 50 pounds too light to be the woman who owned the property. Then they started digging in the hog pen. Section 2. Belle Gunnis Brynhild Polstadter Storset was born in November 1859 in Selbu, Norway, the youngest of 8 children in a family that worked land they did not own. She arrived in the United States in 1881, following an older sister to Chicago, and spent the next few years doing domestic work and saving. She was a physically formidable woman by every account that survives, close to 6 feet tall and heavily built, and she did farm labor that men were normally hired for. In 1884, she married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a Norwegian immigrant working as a department store detective, and the 2 of them opened a confectionery shop on the north side of Chicago. The shop burned down in 1900. The insurance paid out. The family moved into a house that also burned. That insurance paid out as well. Mads Sorensen died on July 30th, 1900. The attending physician attributed it to an enlarged heart, and the family had 2 life insurance policies on him that happened to overlap on that single day, one expiring and one taking effect. The payout was around $8,000, which in 1900 was a sum a working family could not have assembled in a decade. Sorensen's relatives asked for an inquest. It went nowhere. 2 of the couple's children, Caroline and Axel, had already died in infancy of what was recorded as acute colitis, and both had been insured. The insurance industry of that period is the engine of this entire case. Life insurance had spread rapidly through American working-class communities in the 1890s, through door-to-door agents selling small industrial policies with weekly premiums. Agents were paid on commission and had every reason to write policies, and none to investigate the applicant. Medical examination was cursory or absent on smaller policies. Death investigation, on the other end, was handled by an elected county coroner, who in most jurisdictions was not required to be a physician, and toxicology in a rural county was not available at any price. A woman who understood that a payout depended on a signature rather than a scientific finding was operating in a system with almost nothing in the middle. With the money from Sorensen, she bought a farm on McClung Road, just outside LaPorte, Indiana, in 1901. LaPorte sat about 60 miles east of Chicago in flat farming country, close enough to the city for a train, but far enough that nobody in one place knew what happened in the other. The property had a farmhouse, outbuildings, an orchard, and a large hog pen enclosed by high fencing. In April 1902, she married Peter Gunnes, a Norwegian widower with 2 young daughters. One of those daughters died a week after the wedding while alone in the house with her new stepmother. Peter Gunnes died on December 16, 1902. The account given was that a heavy meat-grinding machine had fallen from a shelf onto his head while he was reaching for something in the kitchen, and that scalding brine had also caught him. A coroner's jury looked at the wound, expressed doubt, and returned no charges. The insurance on Peter Gunnes came to around $3,000. That left her with a working farm, no husband, 3 children, and a reputation in the Norwegian-American community as a capable widow. What she did next, she did in print. The advertisements went into the Norwegian-language newspapers that circulated among immigrant communities across the Midwest, including the Chicago paper Skandinaven, which was one of the most widely read Norwegian publications in the country. The advertisements described a comely widow with a first-class farm who wished to meet a gentleman equally well provided for, with the specific condition that no reply would be considered unless the writer was willing to come in person and bring cash sufficient to show he was serious. Personal advertising of that kind was ordinary. Immigrant men who had spent years working alone in mining, logging, and farming had money and no way to meet anyone, and matrimonial columns were the accepted solution. A man traveling from South Dakota or Minnesota to meet a widow in Indiana, with his savings in a bag, was doing something thousands of men did. He was also, in almost every case, traveling to a place where nobody knew him, to meet a woman his own family had never met, having told his relatives only that he expected to be married soon. Men arrived at the Laporte farm and did not leave. Neighbors saw them come. Some were seen for a few days. Then Belle Gunnes would explain that the gentleman had gone back to Norway, or had gone on to Chicago, or had turned out to be unsuitable. Letters written by these men to her survive, and they show her managing multiple correspondences at once, in Norwegian, in a warm and practical voice, telling each of them to sell what he had, tell nobody where he was going, and come. Andrew Helgalian of Aberdeen, South Dakota, arrived in January 1908 with around $3,000. He and Belle went to a Laporte bank together, where he withdrew the money. He was not seen again. His brother, Aksel Helgalian, wrote asking where he was, and received replies suggesting Andrew had gone traveling. Aksel kept writing. By the spring, he had announced he was coming to Indiana himself to look. At the same time, Belle had a problem with a hired man. Ray Lamphere had worked on the farm and had become attached to her, and she had dismissed him in February 1908. She then went to the Laporte authorities and asked to have him declared insane, and had him arrested for trespassing. She also went to a lawyer in town and made a will, saying she feared Lamphere would kill her and her children. The farmhouse burned in the early hours of April 28, 1908. In the cellar, under the collapsed structure, searchers found 4 bodies. 3 were the children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. The 4th was an adult woman without a head. The head was never found. The body did not fit. Belle Gunnes stood around 5 feet 8 and weighed by most accounts well over 200 pounds. The corpse in the cellar was measured at roughly 5 feet 3 and estimated at around 150 pounds, even before accounting for what fire does to a body. That discrepancy was raised immediately and has never been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What the coroner eventually rested identification on was a set of dental bridgework with gold and porcelain teeth, recovered from the debris by a searcher and identified by a Laporte dentist named Ira Norton as work he had done for Belle Gunnes. The circumstances of that recovery, by a man who had been paid to sift the ashes, have been argued about ever since. Aksel Helgalian arrived while the ashes were still being worked and told the sheriff his brother had come to that farm with money and vanished. He suggested they dig. On May 5, 1908, men began opening the soft ground in and around the hog pen, and they found Andrew Helgalian in a gunny sack. Then they found more. The remains were dismembered, wrapped, and buried in a rubbish-filled area of the yard, where the ground was regularly turned over. The final count is usually given as at least 11 and possibly more than a dozen, and it includes Jenny Olson, a foster daughter who had supposedly been sent away to a college in California in 1906. Some of the dead were identified from personal effects and from relatives who came to Laporte after the newspapers carried the story nationally. Others never were. Estimates of the total number of men who answered the advertisements and disappeared have run as high as 40, and that upper figure is a press estimate built from missing person reports rather than from anything recovered from the ground. What happened at the farm during those weeks in May has few equivalents in American criminal history. Word of the excavation moved out of LaPorte on the wire services within a day, and people came. Estimates from local reporting put the number of sightseers on the property at several thousand on the busiest weekend, arriving by train and by wagon. Vendors set up. Photographs were sold. Men climbed the fences to look into the pits while they were still being opened, and the sheriff's office had no capacity to control any of it. Whatever forensic value the ground held was substantially destroyed in the process, which is one reason the identifications were so incomplete and why the final count has never been fixed. The correspondence recovered from the farmhouse and from the families of the missing men is the most revealing material in the case, she wrote in Norwegian, at length, in a voice that was practical rather than romantic. She discussed crop yields and the value of the property. She asked each man what he had and told him to convert it to cash and to tell nobody, on the grounds that people would try to talk him out of a good arrangement. She warned against writing to her at the farm too often. Several of the letters end by telling the recipient to burn them, and the only reason any survive is that the men did not. Jenny Olsen is the case within the case. She was a foster daughter, taken in as a small child, and by 1906 she was 14 and living on the farm. That autumn, Belle told neighbors that Jenny had been sent to a college in Los Angeles to finish her education. Letters purporting to come from Jenny were shown around. Her body came out of the hog pen in May 1908 and was identified from her clothing and hair. A neighbor's later account suggested Jenny may have seen something she was not meant to see, and that account is second-hand and unverified, but the sequence of a girl disappearing and a story being circulated to explain it is the same sequence used for every man who arrived by train. The prosecution that followed was therefore built on the only living person available. Ray Lamphere was tried in November 1908 for murder and arson. The jury acquitted him of murder and convicted him of arson, which is the verdict of a jury that could not agree the woman in the cellar was Belle Gunnis. He was sentenced to 20 years and died of tuberculosis at the Michigan City Prison on December 30th, 1909. Before he died, he gave a statement to a fellow inmate and a minister, claiming that Belle had killed the children, procured a woman's body from Chicago as a substitute, set the fire herself and left. That statement is second-hand, was given by a dying man with reason to be bitter, and has never been corroborated. The families of the missing men are the part of this case with no resolution at all. Norwegian-American immigrant households in Minnesota, the Dakotas and Wisconsin had, in many instances, one relative who had gone east to be married and simply stopped writing, and there was no mechanism by which any of them could have found out what happened. Missing adults were not investigated across state lines. There was no federal reporting, no photographs circulated, and no reason for a sheriff in Indiana to answer a letter from a farm family in South Dakota. Aslil Helgilian was unusual only in his persistence, and the reason the hog pen was opened at all is that one brother refused to accept the same explanation dozens of other families had accepted. Sightings of Belle Gunnis were reported for the next 25 years across the country. In 1931, a woman named Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning an elderly man named August Lindstrom for money. She was Scandinavian, roughly the right age, and had photographs of children in her possession. People from LaPorte were shown her picture and disagreed with each other. She died of tuberculosis before trial. In 2007 and 2008, a forensic team from the University of Indianapolis exhumed the grave in Chicago, holding the remains attributed to Belle Gunnis, hoping to compare DNA against a sealed envelope she had licked. The results were inconclusive. The question of whether the headless woman in the cellar was her remains open, which is the only reason a farm murder case from 1908 is still discussed. What is not open is the ground. Whatever happened on April 28th, the men buried in that hog pen answered a newspaper advertisement, sold what they owned, told nobody where they were going because they had been asked not to, and traveled to Indiana, carrying everything they had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 8 years later, reporters at a Hartford newspaper began counting the death certificates issued by a private nursing home in a quiet Connecticut town, and the number they reached was several times what a house that size should have produced. The woman who ran it sold lifetime care for a single payment. She was also buying arsenic across a pharmacy counter. Section 3. Amy Archer Gilligan. Amy Duggan was born in October 1873 in Milton, Connecticut, one of a large family in a small farming town, and she trained as a nurse without ever completing a formal hospital program. In 1897, she married James Archer. The couple spent several years working as live-in caretakers for a wealthy elderly widower in Newington, and when he died, they took the experience and turned it into a business. In 1907, they bought a house on Prospect Street in Windsor, Connecticut, and opened the Archer Home for elderly and indigent persons. Windsor sat just north of Hartford, an old tobacco-growing town of a few thousand people, and the home was a converted residence rather than an institution. It held somewhere between 10 and 14 residents at a time. The business model is the whole case. There were two ways to enter the Archer Home. A resident could pay weekly at a rate of around $7 to $25 depending on the arrangement, or a resident could pay a single lump sum of $1,000 and be guaranteed care for the remainder of their life. The lump sum option was the one Amy Archer pushed, and it was attractive to exactly the people the home served, which was elderly men and women with a small amount of savings, no children nearby, and a fear of running out of money before they ran out of time. $1,000 in 1910 was a substantial figure, roughly a year and a half of wages for a working man. For the home, it was money received in full on the day of admission, against an obligation of unknown length. A resident who lived 12 years consumed the fee several times over. A resident who lived 8 months was pure profit. Nothing about the arrangement was illegal, and versions of it were offered by private old-age homes across the country in that period, because there was no public pension system in the United States at all. Social Security was still more than 2 decades away. An elderly American in 1910, with no family and no property, had exactly 3 options, which were charity, the county poorhouse, and a private arrangement like this one. The county poorhouse is the reason the Archer Home had customers. Almshouses in Connecticut and everywhere else were institutions of last resort, mixing the elderly with the mentally ill and the destitute, and the fear of ending up in one shaped how older people made decisions about their money. The Archer Home advertised itself as a Christian alternative to that, run by a nurse, in a respectable house on a respectable street. Amy Archer was a devout Catholic, attended church constantly, and was known in Windsor as a woman who took in people nobody else wanted. James Archer died in 1910. The cause given was kidney disease. There was a life insurance policy, taken out shortly before, and it paid. Amy ran the home alone for the next 3 years, and then married a widower named Michael W. Gilligan in 1913. He was reportedly comfortable financially and moved into the house. He died in February 1914, roughly 3 months after the wedding. The certificate said, indigestion. He had left a will, which the state would later argue was a forgery, leaving his estate to his new wife. The deaths at the Archer Home over the following years were not hidden. Every one of them was certified by a local physician, mostly by a Dr. Howard King, and every one of them was buried out of a Windsor undertaker. People find that harder to accept than anything else about it. Nobody was concealing bodies. The bodies went out the front door with paperwork. The number is what eventually broke it. Between 1907 and 1917, the Archer Home recorded somewhere in the region of 60 deaths. Between 1911 and 1916 alone, in a house that could hold 14 people, the figure most often cited is 48. A comparable private home in the same state over the same period recorded a small fraction of that. The person who forced the issue was not an official. Franklin R. Andrews was a resident of the home, in his 60s, in visibly good health, and he spent the day of May 29, 1914, working in the yard. He was dead by the following morning. His sister, Nellie Pierce, did not believe it. Going through his effects, she found correspondence indicating he had been giving Amy Archer Gilligan money beyond what he owed, and she found the household ledger of a man who was being drained. Pierce took her concerns to the local state's attorney, who declined to act on them. She then took them to the Hartford Courant. The paper assigned reporters, and the Courant spent a considerable amount of its own money over the following 2 years building the case that the state would eventually bring. Reporters counted the death certificates. They tracked the payments residents had made. They found that Amy Archer Gilligan had been buying arsenic in unusual quantities from Windsor pharmacies, which she explained as necessary for killing rats in the house. Under the law of the time, arsenic was sold openly across a counter, entered in a poison register with the buyer's name and stated purpose, and rat control was the stated purpose in an enormous share of the entries. The Courant published in 1916 The state acted, and on May 8, 1916, Amy Archer Gilligan was arrested. The exhumations followed. Franklin Andrews was taken up and found to contain arsenic in quantity. Michael Gilligan was taken up and found to contain arsenic. Alice Gowdy, a resident who had died in December 1914, contained arsenic. Charles Smith, a resident who had died in 1914, contained arsenic. Maud Lynch, a younger resident, was found to have died of strychnine. The state ultimately charged 5 murders and went to trial on 1. The Hartford Courant investigation deserves to be described for what it was, because it is one of the earliest examples in the United States of a newspaper building a homicide case that the authorities had declined to build. The paper did not simply publish an accusation. Reporters went to the Windsor town clerk and pulled the death records for the Archer home year by year. They obtained the probate files of former residents and traced what had happened to their money. They went to the pharmacies and asked to see the poison registers, which under Connecticut law recorded the name of every purchaser of arsenic, the quantity, and the stated purpose. They interviewed relatives of the dead across several states. The series ran under the heading of a murder factory, and it produced a public reaction that made further inaction impossible. The state's attorney, who had turned Nellie Pierce away, reopened the matter, and the state police detective assigned to it worked from the paper's material. There is a piece of institutional context that helps explain how the home operated unexamined for a decade. Connecticut did have a state board of charities with authority to visit private institutions caring for dependent people, and it had visited the Archer home more than once and had recorded concerns about the conditions and about the number of deaths. What it did not have was any power to close a private home or to remove a license, because there was no license to remove. The board could observe and report. Amy Archer Gilligan was not evading an inspection regime. She was operating in a country that had not yet built one. The physician question was raised at trial and never satisfactorily answered. Dr. Howard King had signed the great majority of the death certificates at the home over 10 years, attributing the deaths to heart disease, senility, gastric ulcer, and similar conditions. He was not charged with anything and was not alleged to have been complicit. What the case demonstrated was that a physician certifying deaths at a nursing home in 1914 was recording what he had been told by the nurse who had attended the death. In patients he had rarely examined closely, and that he had no way to see his own pattern because he did not keep a running count of it, and nobody asked him to. The lifetime care contract itself outlived her by decades and eventually became a regulated product. Homes across the country sold versions of it into the middle of the 20th century, and the actuarial problem at the center of it never changed, which is that the seller profits precisely in proportion to how quickly the buyer dies. States eventually responded with reserve requirements, escrow rules, and prohibitions on the structure entirely. Connecticut's response to the Archer home was one of the earliest. The trial opened in Hartford in June 1917 and drew national press. The prosecution built the financial case first, showing what each victim had paid into the home and what remained of their assets afterward, and then laid the toxicology on top of it. The defense argued that arsenic in embalmed bodies proved nothing, because embalming fluids of the period had historically contained arsenic compounds, and this was a genuine scientific problem in poisoning cases of that era. The state answered it with quantity and with the timing of the purchases against the timing of the deaths. She was convicted of the murder of Franklin Andrews on July 13, 1917, and sentenced to hang. The Connecticut Supreme Court granted her a new trial in 1919 on evidentiary grounds. Rather than face a second jury, she entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1924, she was declared insane and transferred from the state prison at Wethersfield to the Connecticut Hospital for the Insane at Middletown. She remained there until she died on April 23, 1962, at the age of 88. Mary, her daughter, visited her at Middletown for decades and lived with the case for the rest of her own life. The scale of what happened in that house has never been settled and probably cannot be. 5 murders were charged. 1 conviction was obtained. The number of residents who died in a 14-bed home over 10 years remains the strongest single piece of evidence about the true total, and it is a statistical argument rather than a forensic one, because most of those bodies were never exhumed and are not going to be. 2 things came out of the case beyond the conviction. The first is regulatory. Connecticut had no meaningful licensing or inspection regime for private homes taking in the elderly when Amy Archer Gilligan opened hers, and the state's Board of Charities had visited the Archer home and raised concerns without any power to close it. The scandal fed directly into the licensing and inspection framework that Connecticut and other states built over the following decades, which is the ancestor of modern nursing home regulation. The second is cultural, and it has almost buried the actual case. In 1939, the playwright Joseph Kesselring wrote a comedy about two sweet elderly sisters in Brooklyn who poison lonely old men with elderberry wine, laced with arsenic, and bury them in the cellar. Arsenic and Old Lace opened on Broadway in 1941, ran for more than 1,400 performances, and was filmed by Frank Capra with Cary Grant. Kesselring had spent time in Connecticut, and the Windsor case is generally accepted as his source, though he never confirmed it in those terms. The result is that the most widely known cultural product of these killings is a farce, and that most people who have laughed at it have no idea that the woman it came from was still alive in a state hospital in Middletown when the film was released. The residents of the Archer home have not had anything like that kind of afterlife. Franklin Andrews was a retired man in his 60s who liked working in the garden and who had a sister who would not let it go. Alice Gowdy and her husband Lauren had both entered the home in 1914, and both were dead within months of each other. Charles Smith had paid his $1,000. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 37 years later, a doctor in Tulsa looked at the body of a man who had walked out of his hospital healthy the previous afternoon and ordered an autopsy that nobody had asked for. It came back loaded with arsenic. The widow waiting outside had buried 4 husbands before this one, and she was laughing. Section 4. Nanny Doss. The family Nancy Hazel was born into, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, in November 1905, was run by a father who is described in every account of her life the same way. Jim Hazel controlled everything about his children. He pulled them out of school to work the fields, forbade his daughters to wear makeup or attend social events, and screened anyone who came near them. Nanny's formal education ended early and stayed that way. She read poorly for the rest of her life. When she was around 7, the family took a train south, and Nanny struck her head against a metal seat bar when the train braked hard. She reported headaches, blackouts, and depression from that point onward, and attributed a great deal about herself to that injury in later interviews. Whether the injury explains anything is not established, and it is worth saying plainly that a childhood head injury is one of the most commonly offered explanations in criminal cases, and one of the least testable. What she did have was romance magazines. Her mother subscribed to them, and Nanny read the fiction and, more importantly, the Lonely Hearts columns at the back, in which men and women advertised for correspondence with a view to marriage. Those columns were a national institution in the early 20th century, the same market that Belle Gunness had worked from the other side 20 years earlier, and they set the terms in which Nanny Hazel understood what a marriage was supposed to be. At 16, she married Charlie Braggs, a co-worker at the Linen Thread Company in Anniston. They had 4 daughters. In 1927, the 2 middle daughters died within a short period of what was recorded as food poisoning. Braggs left, taking the eldest girl, and later said he had been afraid of his wife and had noticed that he only got sick after eating food she had prepared. He is one of 2 men in this case who left instead of dying. In 1929, she married Frank Harrelson, a factory worker from Jacksonville, Alabama, whom she had met through a Lonely Hearts column. The marriage lasted 16 years, and by every account it was bad. He drank heavily and had an assault conviction she learned about afterward. In 1943, her grandson, Robert Lee Haynes, died while in her care. In 1945, on the night the country celebrated the end of the war, Harrelson came home drunk, and Nanny put rat poison into the jar of corn whiskey he kept buried in the yard. He died in agony over the following days. The second husband is where the pattern becomes visible in hindsight, and it also shows what she was actually doing. Rat poison in that period was arsenic trioxide, sold in tins in any general store, with no restriction beyond a signature. Its symptoms in acute overdose of violent vomiting, abdominal pain, and collapse, and in an era before routine toxicological screening, they were indistinguishable to a country physician from gastroenteritis, food poisoning, or the flu. Arsenic killed quietly in plain sight for a century because the deaths it produced looked exactly like the deaths people expected. The thing that eventually closed off her method was not law enforcement. Arsenic-based rodenticides had been sold across American counters since the 19th century, and the poison registers that pharmacists and general stores were required to keep recorded a purchaser's name and stated purpose, and were almost never read by anybody afterward. What removed arsenic from the average American kitchen cupboard was a change in the product. Warfarin, an anticoagulant developed in the 1940s and introduced commercially as a rodent poison at the end of that decade, worked better, cost less, and was far less dangerous to the people using it. By the end of the 1950s, it had largely displaced the arsenical compounds in household use. Nanny Doss was buying her supply in the last years in which walking into a store and asking for it was ordinary. In 1947, she married Arlie Lanning in Lexington, North Carolina, after a courtship conducted almost entirely through the mail. He was another drinker. Lanning died in 1952 of what was recorded as heart failure. The house he lived in, which he had left to his sister, burned to the ground shortly afterward, and Nanny collected on the insurance. Lanning's mother died in her sleep while Nanny was staying in the house caring for her. Nanny's own sister Dovie, bedridden, died while Nanny was visiting. By this stage, she had joined a correspondence club called the Diamond Circle Club, which functioned as a paid matchmaking service for people looking for spouses by mail. She used it to find Richard L. Morton of Emporia, Kansas, and married him in October 1952. Morton was not a drinker, but he was unfaithful, and by her own later account, that was worse. Her mother, Louisa Hazel, came to stay with them in January 1953 and died within days of arriving. Richard Morton died 3 months later. The correspondence clubs she used were a commercial industry, with no oversight of any kind. A subscriber paid a fee, received a list of names and addresses, and began writing. The clubs took no interest in whether anybody on the list was who they said they were, and postal authorities took an interest only when money was solicited by outright fraud. Nanny Doss found 2 husbands through that system, and a third through a magazine column, and in each case the man knew exactly what she had chosen to write to him. In June 1953, she married Samuel Doss, a highway inspector in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was a rigid, religious, careful man who disapproved of her romance magazines and controlled the household money closely, which by all accounts she found intolerable in a way that the drinkers had not been. In September 1954, he was admitted to hospital with severe digestive symptoms and was treated for what was diagnosed as an infection. He improved. He was discharged on October 5, 1954, went home, ate a meal, and died that night. The physician who had treated him, Dr. N.Z. Schwelbein, had a man who had recovered under observation in his hospital and died within hours of leaving it. He ordered an autopsy. The stomach contents contained a quantity of arsenic that the state medical examiner's office described as enough to kill many people over. The investigation that followed moved fast because Nanny Doss did not resist it. Under questioning in Tulsa, she gave a series of statements over several days, and she was cheerful throughout them. She laughed. She corrected the detectives on details. She asked for her romance magazines. The press covered the interviews as much as the crimes, and gave her the names that stuck, the giggling granny and the jolly black widow, and photographs from that week show a small round woman in glasses smiling at the camera in a police station. The admissions covered 4 of her husbands. On the others, she was inconsistent. Exhumations followed in Alabama, North Carolina, and Kansas, and arsenic was recovered from Arlie Lanning, Richard Morton, and Frank Harrelson. Investigators eventually attributed 11 deaths to her, including her mother, her sister, her 2 daughters, her grandson, and a mother-in-law, though the majority of those were never charged. The motive she offered has been repeated for 70 years and deserves to be looked at rather than accepted. She told investigators she had been searching for romance, for the man in the stories, and that each husband had failed to be him. Investigators found something less poetic underneath it. Every death produced money. Harrelson had insurance. Lanning had insurance and a house that burned. Morton had insurance. Samuel Doss had 2 policies, and Nanny had made sure of them. Her mother's small estate came to her. The romantic explanation was the one she gave in interviews, and the one the newspapers wanted, and the financial pattern is the one that shows up in the paperwork. The exhumations that followed her confession show what a multi-state poisoning case looked like before any national infrastructure existed to handle one. Oklahoma had a body and a toxicology result. Alabama had graves in 2 counties. North Carolina had Arlie Lanning and his mother. Kansas had Richard Morton and Louisa Hazel. Each of those states had to be persuaded separately to open a grave, at its own expense, with its own court order, on the strength of a statement given in a Tulsa police station to detectives with no authority anywhere else. Most of them did it. Arsenic was recovered in Alabama, North Carolina, and Kansas. What none of the states did was bring a case, and the reason was practical rather than legal. Nanny Doss was going to spend the rest of her life in an Oklahoma prison regardless, and a second or third or fourth trial in another jurisdiction meant transporting a prisoner across the country, empaneling a jury, and spending public money to obtain a sentence that would have no effect on how long she was held. Prosecutors in 3 states independently reached the same conclusion, which means that 7 of the 11 deaths attributed to her have never been examined by a court in any form. A psychiatric examination was carried out before the plea. The evaluation concluded she was competent and was not legally insane, which is what made the guilty plea possible and what closed off the route Jane Toppin and Amy Archer Gilligan had both taken to a hospital rather than a prison. The finding has been questioned since, on the basis of little beyond how she behaved in front of cameras. The press coverage that week is a period piece in itself. Newspapers across the country ran photographs of a smiling grandmother in glasses and built the story around the contrast between her appearance and what she had done, and that framing has never gone away. The guilty plea was entered in Tulsa on May 17, 1955, to the murder of Samuel Doss. Oklahoma did not seek the death penalty, and the reason stated at the time was straightforward and had nothing to do with the evidence. The prosecutor and the judge both indicated that the state was not prepared to execute a woman, and she received life imprisonment. Samuel Doss was the only one of her victims whose case ever reached a courtroom. The sentence was served at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary at McAllister, where she worked in the prison hospital laundry, and asked more than once to be allowed to work in the kitchen. The warden declined. She died of leukemia in the prison hospital on June 2, 1965, at 59. The strongest fact in the case is one that nobody arranged. Between 1927 and 1954, across 4 states, a woman buried 2 daughters, a grandson, a mother, a sister, 2 mothers-in-law, and 4 husbands, and not one physician in 27 years ordered a toxicology screen until a Tulsa doctor got annoyed about a discharge that had gone wrong. Every death before that had been certified by someone as natural. The system that was supposed to catch this consisted of individual county physicians looking at individual bodies with no ability to see that the same woman had been standing beside all of them. Charlie Braggs, the first husband, lived into old age. He gave interviews after her arrest and described food he had refused to eat and a wife he had been afraid to sleep near. And he said he had never gone to anyone about it because there was nothing to tell anyone. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 23 years later, in North Carolina, a woman with a prescription drug habit and a stack of forged checks was buying ant poison at a hardware store and stirring it into beer and tea. 6 people around her died over 8 years. She would become the first woman put to death in America in more than 22 years. Section 5. Velma Barfield. Margie Velma Bullard was born in October 1932 in South Carolina and grew up in Cumberland County, North Carolina, the second of 9 children in a sharecropping family that moved when the work moved. Her father worked in a textile mill and farmed on the side. Her mother, Lily, held the household together. Velma left school at 17 and married Thomas Burke, and for most of the next 2 decades she lived the life the region produced, which was a mill-town marriage with 2 children, a house on a small lot, and work in a store when money was short. The turn came in 1966 when she had a hysterectomy and was prescribed medication for the recovery, and then more medication for her nerves, and then more for sleep. What followed is one of the more thoroughly documented prescription drug dependencies in an American criminal case, and it is the mechanism behind everything else. She was taking Valium, Librium, Sinequan, and a rotating set of other tranquilizers and sedatives, prescribed by multiple physicians who did not know about each other, filled at multiple pharmacies that had no way to know about each other either. Prescription monitoring did not exist. A patient in North Carolina in 1970 who wanted 4 doctors could have 4 doctors, and the only limit on the supply was the ability to pay for it and keep the appointments. The marriage came apart under it. Thomas Burke drank, she used, and the 2 things fed each other. In 1969, he fell asleep on the sofa smoking, and the house caught fire. He died in it. She was not charged with anything, and the fire was recorded as accidental, and it remains recorded that way. It is worth being clear that no evidence has ever established she caused it. Jennings Barfield became her second husband in 1970. He was a widower in poor health, with heart trouble and diabetes, and he was dead within a year, in March 1971, of what was certified as heart failure. When his body was exhumed years later, arsenic was found. He was never part of a murder charge against her, and she denied killing him for a long time before eventually including him in her admissions. In 1974, her mother, Lily Bullard, became suddenly and violently ill with vomiting and diarrhea, recovered, and then became ill again and died. The certificate said, natural causes. Velma had by that point been forging checks on her mother's account. The financial pattern in this case is simple, and it never changes. Her habit cost more than she had. She covered the gap by taking money from the people closest to her, mostly by writing checks on their accounts, and by taking out small loans in their names. That worked until the person noticed. When a person noticed, they died. Between 1976 and 1978, she supported herself doing live-in care work for elderly people, which is a job that in rural North Carolina in that period required no certification, no background check, and no supervision. Families hired a woman from the community who was known to be reliable and had done it before. She had references. She was good at the work itself, patient with people who were difficult, and families were grateful to her. Montgomery and Dolly Edwards were an elderly couple in Lumberton she was hired to care for. Montgomery Edwards died in January 1977. Dolly Edwards died 6 weeks later, in early March, after several days of vomiting and burning stomach pain. Velma had been forging checks on their account. Dolly Edwards was also the aunt of a man named Stuart Taylor, which is how Velma met him. Record Lee and her husband John Henry Lee were her next employers. John Henry Lee died in June 1977 after a period of the same symptoms. Velma had taken out a loan in his name and forged his signature on the check. Stuart Taylor was a tobacco farmer, a widower, and by 1977 he was Velma's boyfriend. He was also the person who found out. He had begun to notice discrepancies in his accounts and had said he intended to look into it. On the last weekend of January 1978, the two of them went to a Rex Humbard revival meeting together, and by then she had already begun putting Singletary's Rat Killer, an arsenic-based product she bought at a hardware store for a couple of dollars, into his beer and his tea. He became severely ill. She drove him to hospital herself and sat with him and told the staff he had a stomach virus. He was treated for gastroenteritis and sent home. She brought him back. He died on February 3, 1978. Taylor's family did not accept it. A relative pushed for an autopsy, and the North Carolina Medical Examiner's Office found arsenic. Velma Barfield was arrested on March 13, 1978, and within a short period she had given a statement admitting to 4 killings, which were Stuart Taylor, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee, and her own mother. The trial was held in Elizabethtown in Bladen County in November and December 1978, on the single count of Stuart Taylor's murder. The prosecution ran it as a financial case rather than a psychological one. Joe Freeman Britt, the district attorney, was at that time recorded as the most successful capital prosecutor in the United States by number of death sentences obtained. And he presented Velma Barfield as a woman who had killed repeatedly and specifically to keep a forgery scheme from being discovered. The defense presented the drug dependency and argued diminished capacity. The jury convicted on December 2, 1978, and returned a sentence of death. What happened over the following 6 years is the reason this case is remembered outside North Carolina. Velma Barfield became a Christian in prison, in a way that a great many people who had no reason to be sympathetic to her found credible. She worked in the prison as a counselor to other inmates, and women at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women described her as the person they went to. She corresponded with people around the world. Ruth Bell Graham, the wife of Billy Graham, took up her case, visited her, and wrote publicly in support of clemency. The clemency campaign was one of the largest of its era, and it failed. Appeals ran to the United States Supreme Court and were declined. Governor James Hunt was in the middle of a United States Senate campaign against Jesse Helms during the final stage of the case, and the timing of the clemency decision against the timing of that election has been argued about ever since by people on both sides. Hunt denied clemency on November 1, 1984. The appellate history ran through the North Carolina Supreme Court, the Federal District Court, and the Fourth Circuit, and the arguments made on her behalf concerned the introduction of the other deaths at her trial and the adequacy of the diminished capacity defense given the volume of medication she had been taking. Each level upheld the conviction and the sentence, and the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene twice. The execution itself was procedurally new. Lethal injection had first been used anywhere in the world in Texas in December 1982, less than 2 years earlier, and no woman had been executed by any method in the United States since 1962. North Carolina had not carried out an execution of any kind since 1961, and had used a gas chamber before that. The state was therefore operating an untested procedure on a defendant whose case had drawn international attention, and the preparations were reported at the time in a level of detail that the Department of Correction had not anticipated having to accommodate. Several hundred people gathered outside Central Prison in Raleigh through the night. Opponents of the death penalty held a vigil, supporters of it held a counter-demonstration, and there were people present holding signs that referred to the way Stuart Taylor had died. Both groups were reported in roughly equal numbers. The reason the case became a national argument, rather than a state one, was the sequence of who she had been at each stage. The prosecution's Velma Barfield was accurate to 1978. The clemency campaign's Velma Barfield was accurate to 1984. The debate that ran in the American press through the autumn of that year was really about whether a legal system that sentences people is entitled to take account of who they have become by the time the sentence is carried out, and that question was not resolved by anything that happened at 2 in the morning on November 2. The mechanics of her drug supply were laid out at trial in detail. She was obtaining prescriptions from several physicians simultaneously, filling them at pharmacies across 2 counties, and at points forging prescriptions outright. When money ran short, she wrote checks on the accounts of the people she was employed to care for. Each killing in the sequence followed the same trigger, which was a person noticing a check they had not written. The execution was carried out by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, shortly after 2 in the morning on November 2, 1984. She declined a last meal in the traditional sense and asked for a bag of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. She wore pink pajamas and a blue robe because she had asked not to be executed in prison clothing. She apologized to the families of the people she killed. She was 52 years old. That made her the first woman executed in the United States after the Supreme Court permitted capital punishment to resume in 1976, and the first person of either sex in North Carolina to be executed by lethal injection. 22 years had passed since the last execution of a woman in the country, which had been Elizabeth Duncan in California in 1962. Her death drew several hundred demonstrators to the prison gates and an enormous volume of national coverage, and it functioned as a test of whether the restored death penalty would be applied to a woman at all. At her own request, her body was donated to medical research. There are parts of this case that resist the clean version told in either direction. The people who supported her were not wrong that the woman in Central Prison in 1984 bore little resemblance to the woman who had been buying rat poison in 1977, and the prosecution was not wrong that 6 people were dead and that every one of them had died after noticing money going missing. Both of those things are true at once, and the case has been used ever since as an argument for and against capital punishment by people who select which half to talk about. The victims are the part that usually falls out. Dolly Edwards was in her 80s and had just buried her husband. John Henry Lee was in his 70s and had a wife who survived him and who had employed Velma out of trust. Lily Bullard was her mother, and she took several days to die. Stuart Taylor was 56 and was killed because he had said out loud that he was going to check his bank statements. Ronnie Burke and Kim, her 2 surviving children, have spoken publicly in the decades since about growing up in that household and about what it is to be the child of both the killer and, in the case of their grandmother, one of the victims. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. That same year, a Florida jury was hearing how a car had exploded on a street in Pensacola with a businessman inside it. He survived. What investigators found when they pulled his medical history apart led them to a drowned 19-year-old in leg braces, a soldier dead in 1971, and a body in a Colorado cemetery. Section 6. Judias Buenoano. Judias Welty was born in April 1943 in Quanah, Texas, a small town near the Oklahoma line. and her early life is documented mostly through what she said about it later and what court records established afterward. Her mother died of tuberculosis when she was 2. She and a brother were separated from their siblings and, by her account, sent to relatives who used them as farm labor and beat them. She was placed in state care in New Mexico as a teenager after an assault charge and spent time in a reform institution. She left as soon as she was able and worked as a nursing assistant. In March 1961, she had a son, Michael, whose father she never named. In January 1962, she married James Goodyear, an Air Force sergeant stationed at Eglin in the Florida Panhandle, and he adopted Michael. They had 2 more children, James Jr. and Kimberly. For most of the following decade, she was a service wife in Orlando, Florida, and to everyone who knew her, she was competent, presentable, and busy. James Goodyear returned from a tour in Vietnam in 1971 and became ill that September with vomiting, weakness, and progressive nerve damage in his hands and feet. He was admitted to the Naval Hospital in Orlando and died on September 16, 1971. The certificate said his death followed a viral infection. There were 3 life insurance policies. 3 months later, the family home burned. That was insured too. The pattern in this case is different from the ones before it, in a specific way. Judius Buenoano was not draining small amounts from elderly people to cover a habit. She was building a series of insurance claims over more than a decade, in different states, under different names, with intervals long enough that no single insurer or investigator ever saw 2 of them together. Trinidad, Colorado came next, in 1977, with a boyfriend named Bobby Joe Morris. Morris became ill in January 1978, with symptoms that matched Goodyear's, was hospitalized, improved, went home and died on January 28, 1978. He was 32. He had been insured, and Judius collected. Shortly after his death, she legally changed her family's surname. Goodyear translates loosely into Spanish as Buen Año, and she rendered it Buenoano, which is the name she used for the rest of her life. She has never given a satisfactory explanation for the change, and prosecutors later argued the obvious one, which was that a new surname breaks the paper trail connecting a woman to the claims she has already made. Florida came next, the Pensacola area, where she set up a business. She operated a beauty salon and presented herself in the community as a nurse, wearing the uniform and using the title, which was not true. She had no nursing qualification. She also had an interest in enrolling her son in the army. Michael Goodyear needs to be set out plainly. In 1979, at 18, he enlisted in the army and was posted to Fort Benning. In late 1979, he became ill with a progressive weakness and numbness in his arms and legs. He was hospitalized. Army physicians diagnosed arsenic and thallium poisoning and treated him for it, and the damage to his nerves was permanent. He was discharged and came home to his mother in Florida, wearing heavy metal braces on both legs and prosthetic supports on his arms. He could not walk unaided and could not swim. On May 13, 1980, Judius Buenoano took Michael and her younger son James on a canoe trip on the East River near Milton, Florida. The canoe capsized. James got to shore. Judius got to shore. Michael, in the braces, went down in the river and drowned. He was 19. The account she gave was that the canoe had struck a submerged log. The Santa Rosa County investigators who worked the scene at the time noted that the water was shallow, that the weather was fine, and that a mother had taken a paralyzed young man in metal braces canoeing at all. It was recorded as an accident. There were insurance policies on Michael Goodyear's life, and they paid. What ended it was a man who did not die. John Gentry was a Pensacola businessman and Judius's fiancée by 1982. She told him she was pregnant, which she was not. She began giving him what she described as vitamin capsules, and he became progressively ill through late 1982, with nausea, weakness, and the same nerve symptoms that had preceded 3 earlier deaths. He was hospitalized and improved when he stopped taking them. On June 25, 1983, Gentry started his car outside a restaurant in downtown Pensacola and a bomb detonated under the dashboard. He survived with serious injuries. The Pensacola police and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms worked the bombing as an attempted murder, and the investigation moved almost immediately to the woman who had increased the life insurance on him shortly beforehand and who had been feeding him capsules. One of those capsules was recovered and analyzed. It contained paraformaldehyde, not vitamins. Once investigators had her name, they went backward. They found James Goodyear's death certificate. They found Bobby Joe Morris in Colorado. They found Michael Goodyear in the river. Bodies were exhumed in Florida and in Trinidad, Colorado, and arsenic was recovered from James Goodyear, from Bobby Joe Morris, and from Michael Goodyear. No insurer ever queried any of it. Claims arising from her husband's, her partner, and her son were paid by different companies in different states over 12 years, and there was no shared industry database in that period through which a claims adjuster in Florida could have discovered that the same beneficiary had collected in Colorado. The surname change removed even the possibility of a coincidental match. The prosecutions ran across 3 separate proceedings. In 1984, she was tried in Pensacola for the attempted murder of John Gentry and convicted, receiving 12 years. In March 1984, she was tried in Santa Rosa County for the first-degree murder of her son Michael and convicted, receiving life imprisonment. In 1985, she was tried in Orlando for the murder of her husband James Goodyear, convicted and sentenced to death. The Colorado death of Bobby Joe Morris was investigated and the arsenic was found, but no charge was brought there because she was already under a death sentence in Florida. The Michael Goodyear conviction is the one that shaped how the case was covered because the prosecution had to prove that a drowning was a murder. The argument they made was cumulative rather than direct. There was no witness who saw her tip the canoe. What the state put in front of the jury was the poisoning at Fort Benning that had put him in the braces, the fact that his mother had been the source of what he ate, the insurance, and the decision to take a young man who could not swim and could not remove 20 pounds of metal from his legs out into a river. The jury accepted it. The press called her the Black Widow, and she has been described that way in every account since. She was held on Florida's death row at Broward Correctional Institution for 13 years. Appeals ran their course. Clemency was denied. The Colorado exhumation is the one that shows how far back the pattern ran. Bobby Joe Morris had been buried in Trinidad, Colorado since 1978, and the local authorities had closed his death as natural. Florida investigators working the Gentry bombing in 1984 contacted them, and the body was taken up and tested, and it contained arsenic. Trinidad had no reason to have looked in 1978, and no way to have known in 1984 that anybody would ever ask. There is also the matter of what she told people she was. Judias Buenoano operated in Pensacola for years, describing herself as a registered nurse, wearing the uniform, and using the standing that comes with it. She had no such qualification and had never held one. That detail mattered to the prosecutions because it explained how she was able to talk to physicians about her son's condition, describe symptoms in clinical language, and be taken seriously as an informed caregiver by hospital staff who had no reason to check. Michael Goodyear's medical file was the strongest single document in the case, and it had existed, complete and correct, since 1980. Army physicians at Fort Benning had run the tests, identified arsenic and thallium, recorded the finding, and treated him. Nobody had asked where a soldier on a Georgia base was getting heavy metals into his system, and when he was discharged, he was sent home to the only person who had been feeding him. 13 years followed on death row at Broward Correctional Institution, filing appeals through the Florida Supreme Court and the federal courts, all of which were denied. Clemency was refused by Governor Lawton Chiles. Florida's electric chair had a history of its own by 1998. It had malfunctioned during 2 executions earlier in the decade, producing flames and heavy smoke, and there was active litigation and legislative argument in the state about whether it should continue to be used at all. Her execution was carried out without incident and was followed by a substantial press presence outside the prison at Stark, drawn largely by the fact that a woman was being executed. The state legislature moved to lethal injection 2 years later. The execution was carried out in Florida's electric chair at Florida State Prison on the morning of March 30th, 1998. She was 54. She was the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, which is a gap of 150 years, and only the third woman executed anywhere in the United States since capital punishment resumed in 1976. She maintained her innocence to the end and made no final statement of substance. What separates this case from most of the others in this video is that nothing about it was concealed by an institution. Every death was investigated at the time by somebody. A physician certified James Goodyear. A Colorado hospital treated Bobby Joe Morris. Army doctors at Fort Benning correctly diagnosed arsenic and thallium poisoning in a 19-year-old soldier, documented it, and treated him for it. Santa Rosa County deputies stood on the bank of the East River, and thought the drowning was strange enough to write down that they thought it was strange. None of them could see any of the others. The army knew a soldier had been poisoned and had no reason to look at a death certificate in Orlando from 1971. The Florida deputies knew a paralyzed young man had drowned and had no access to a Colorado hospital record. There was no database that connected an insurance claim in Trinidad to an insurance claim in Pensacola, particularly once the surname changed. Judas Buenoano ran for 12 years inside the gaps between agencies that each held one true piece of it. John Gentry, the man who lived, testified at every one of her trials. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. A year before that Pensacola car bomb, a pediatric intensive care unit in San Antonio was losing children at a rate that made no medical sense, and everyone on the ward knew which shift they died on. The hospital's answer was to reorganize the unit and let the nurses go quietly. One of them took a job at a rural clinic 60 miles away. Section 7. Janine Jones. Janine Jones was born in July 1950 in San Antonio, Texas, and adopted as an infant by Dick and Gladys Jones, a couple who ran a nightclub and a billboard business. Her adoptive father died of cancer when she was 16. A brother died at 17 when a homemade pipe bomb he was working on detonated. People who knew her as a young woman consistently described someone who needed to be the center of whatever room she was in and who responded to attention the way other people respond to money. Married at 18, she had 2 children, divorced, and in 1977 completed a licensed vocational nurse program in San Antonio. The distinction between a licensed vocational nurse and a registered nurse matters in this case. An LVN in Texas at that time completed roughly a year of training, worked under the supervision of an RN or a physician, and had a defined and limited scope of practice. Janine Jones spent her entire career at the bottom of a professional hierarchy, in units where the decisions that mattered were made by people with far more training than she had, and every account of her behavior on those units describes a woman who acted as though the hierarchy did not apply to her. The first 2 nursing jobs both ended in dismissal. In 1978, she was hired into the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Bexar County Hospital, the public teaching hospital attached to the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. She worked the 3 to 11 shift. A pediatric intensive care unit is the single worst environment in a hospital for detecting what she was doing, and the reasons are structural. The patients are infants and small children who cannot report symptoms. They are already critically ill, which means a sudden deterioration is not by itself remarkable. Their body weight is small enough that a tiny quantity of almost any drug produces a catastrophic effect. Drugs are drawn up at the bedside from vials kept on the unit, rather than dispensed, dose by dose, from a pharmacy. And when a child in that unit arrests, the response is a resuscitation involving a crowd of people moving fast, in which nobody is auditing what went into the line. Children began dying on the 3 to 11 shift in numbers that the unit's own staff noticed. The nurses had a name for it among themselves. Over roughly 4 years, the unit recorded a death toll that reviewers afterward estimated at somewhere between 20 and 42 children more than the unit would statistically have expected, and the correlation with one nurse's shifts was visible to the people working there. Jones was frequently the one who found the child in distress, frequently the one who called the code, and frequently the one who performed the resuscitation, with an intensity that colleagues found excessive and that she was praised for by people who did not work the ward. Nurses raised it. Physicians raised it. In 1981 and 1982, the hospital conducted internal reviews. What the institution did with the conclusion is the part of this case that has never stopped generating anger. In early 1982, the hospital reorganized the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit and replaced all licensed vocational nurses with registered nurses. That change removed Janine Jones from the unit without accusing her of anything, without reporting her to the Texas Board of Nurse Examiners, and without generating any record that would follow her. She resigned in March 1982 with her file intact. Hospital administrators later faced sustained criticism for choosing an approach that eliminated the problem from their building and passed it to whoever hired her next, and a Bexar County grand jury that examined the deaths in 1983 was told that a substantial quantity of the unit's records from the relevant period had been destroyed under a records retention policy while the investigation was underway. In August 1982, she went to work for Dr. Kathleen Holland, a pediatrician opening a new practice in Kerrville, Texas, a town of around 15,000 people in the Hill Country, about 60 miles northwest of San Antonio. Holland had trained in San Antonio and had worked alongside Jones. She hired her as the clinic's nurse and let her live in a house she owned. The clinic opened on August 23, 1982. Within a month, 7 children had suffered sudden respiratory arrest inside it, in a rural pediatric office that had existed for a few weeks. Each time, Jones was present. Each time, the child stopped breathing and had to be resuscitated and transferred by ambulance to the hospital in Kerrville. Emergency room staff in Kerrville began remarking on the frequency of the transfers, and the hospital raised it with Holland. On September 17, 1982, a 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan was brought to the clinic by her mother, Petty McClellan, for what were minor complaints. Chelsea had been born premature and had some breathing difficulties in infancy, but was doing well. Jones gave her injections. Chelsea went into respiratory arrest, was taken by ambulance towards San Antonio, and died on the way. Kathleen Holland found a bottle of succinylcholine in the clinic that had gone missing and then reappeared, with puncture marks in the rubber seal and the contents diluted. Succinylcholine is a paralytic. It is used in surgery and in emergency airway management to stop a patient breathing so a tube can be placed. And it does exactly one thing, which is to paralyze every muscle in the body, including the diaphragm. A conscious patient who receives it is fully aware and completely unable to move or breathe. It has no legitimate use in a pediatric outpatient clinic, and there was no reason for it to be there. Holland reported it. The testimony that eventually came out of Bexar County Hospital showed how completely the staff had understood it at the time. Nurses described counting deaths among themselves, avoiding assigning her the sickest children, and warning colleagues privately. Physicians described requesting that she not be involved in particular cases. All of it was informal. None of it was written down in a form that created an obligation on anybody, and the internal reviews that did occur were conducted by an institution weighing its own exposure. 2 grand juries were convened, one in Kerr County looking at the clinic, and one in Bexar County looking at the hospital. The Kerr County proceeding produced the charges that put her in prison. The forensic case was built on exhumation and on a laboratory technique that was new. Chelsea McClellan's body was exhumed in 1983, and tissue was tested for succinylcholine and its metabolic breakdown product, succinylmonocholine. The drug had long been considered effectively undetectable after death because it breaks down rapidly, and its reputation as an undetectable poison was well established in the medical literature. A Swedish toxicologist, Bo Holmstedt, working with radioimmunoassay techniques, was able to demonstrate the presence of the metabolite in the tissue. That evidence was the centerpiece of the trial and was contested by the defense throughout. In February 1984, a jury in Georgetown, Texas, convicted Janine Jones of the murder of Chelsea McClellan and sentenced her to 99 years. In October 1984, a second jury convicted her of injuring Rolando Santos, a 4-week-old boy who had suffered repeated inexplicable bleeding and cardiac arrests at Bexar County Hospital, and sentenced her to 60 years to run concurrently. Bexar County never charged her with any of the deaths at the hospital in the 1980s. The sentence then ran into a piece of Texas law that had nothing to do with her. Texas, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was operating under a mandatory release statute designed to relieve severe prison overcrowding, which awarded good conduct time so aggressively that inmates sentenced under it became eligible for automatic release after serving a fraction of the term. The law applied to offences committed in the window her crimes fell into. It had been repealed long before, but it applied to her by the date of the offence, and the arithmetic meant that a woman sentenced to 99 years in 1984 for killing a 15-month-old was due to walk out of prison in March 2018. Petty McClellan had been saying so for years. So had prosecutors. As the date came closer, the Bexar County District Attorney's Office under Nico LaHood began reopening the San Antonio deaths that had never been charged, working from surviving hospital records, autopsy material, and the recollections of staff, and in May 2017 filed a murder charge over the death of Joshua Sawyer, an 11-month-old boy who died at Bexar County Hospital on December 12, 1981, with a toxic level of the anticonvulsant Dilantin in his system that no physician had ordered. 4 more indictments followed over the deaths of Rolando Santos, Patrick Zavala, Richard Nelson, and Paul Villarreal. The new charges held her past the release date. On January 16, 2020, rather than face trial, Janine Jones pleaded guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer and was sentenced to life imprisonment. As part of the arrangement, the remaining indictments were dropped, and she also entered a plea in connection with Rolando Santos. She was 69. Under the terms, she will not be eligible for release. Kathleen Holland's career did not survive it. She had opened a practice at 30, in a town where she intended to spend her working life, and within a month it had become a crime scene. She was sued by families, faced action affecting her medical license, and eventually left Kerrville. Every account of the case describes her as the person who found the succinylcholine vial and reported it, and also as someone who had hired a nurse other people at Bexar County Hospital had already privately concluded was dangerous on the strength of a personal recommendation and her own impressions, because nothing in the formal record said otherwise. Succinylcholine has a history in criminal cases that predates this one. It was used in a New Jersey murder prosecution in 1966, and its reputation among people who read about such things was precisely that it disappeared. That reputation was correct until the analytical chemistry caught up with it, and the Jones case is the point at which it stopped being true. The technique used on Chelsea McClellan's tissue has since been refined considerably, and the drug is now detectable through its breakdown product in a way that has closed off what was for decades a genuine gap. The 2017 reinvestigation was an unusual piece of work. Prosecutors were reconstructing deaths that had occurred 35 years earlier in an institution that no longer existed in the same form, from records that had been substantially culled, with witnesses who had retired or died, and with autopsy material that had to be located and re-examined. What made it possible in the Joshua Sawyer case was a preserved toxicology result showing a level of dilantin that could not have come from any prescribed dose, sitting in a file that had never been acted on because nobody in 1981 had a reason to connect one dead infant to a pattern. Texas also changed its law because of her. The reporting requirement that came out of the case obliges a hospital to notify the state licensing board when a nurse is dismissed or resigns in circumstances involving patient safety, which is the exact step Bexar County Hospital chose not to take in March 1982. The number of children she killed is not known and is not going to be. The figure of up to 60 appears constantly in coverage of the case, and it originates in estimates made by investigators and journalists working from mortality statistics at Bexar County Hospital, rather than from any established finding. 2 deaths have been established in court, one in 1984 and one by plea in 2020, across a career in which she was present for dozens. What is established, and what has made this case a permanent fixture in hospital risk management training, is the institutional decision. Bexar County Hospital identified a problem, reviewed it internally, and resolved it by removing a category of employee rather than by naming an individual. No report went to the state licensing board. No warning went to Kathleen Holland, a physician who had trained in that same hospital. 7 children stopped breathing in a Kerrville clinic within a month of it opening, and one of them died because the institution that had already worked out what was happening chose an option that protected itself from liability and left the woman free to be hired. Petty and Reed McClellan lobbied the Texas legislature afterward, and a law was passed requiring hospitals to report nurses to the licensing board when they are dismissed for conduct affecting patient safety. Chelsea McClellan is buried in Kerrville. Her mother spent 38 years making sure the release date did not arrive quietly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 4 years after that Texas verdict, a social worker in Sacramento reported a missing tenant, and detectives went to dig in a garden on F Street. The landlady was a small woman in her late 50s who fed the homeless and kept a garden people stopped to look at. She asked whether she might walk to the corner for a cup of coffee, and they let her. Section 8, Dorothea Puente, Redlands, California, in January 1929, produced Dorothea Helen Gray, one of 7 children of a tubercular father and an alcoholic mother. Her father died when she was 8, her mother died in a motorcycle accident when she was 9, and the children were split between relatives and an orphanage in Fresno. She married for the first time at 16. The 40 years between that and the events on F Street contain a great deal of documented criminal activity and a great deal of invention. She was convicted of forging checks in 1948 and served time. She ran a brothel in Sacramento in the 1960s and was convicted of managing it. She married 4 times, took different surnames, and told people she had been a nurse, a doctor's wife, a member of a European family, a survivor of Pearl Harbor. Almost none of it was true, and she told all of it convincingly. In 1978, she was convicted of forging 34 checks. In 1982, she was convicted of drugging and robbing 4 elderly people she had met in Sacramento bars, having given them sedatives and taken their valuables and their cash. She served time at the California Institution for Women and was released on parole in 1985, with 2 explicit conditions attached, which were that she was not to handle government benefit checks belonging to anyone else, and that she was not to run a business caring for the elderly. Both conditions were violated within weeks, in a 2-story Victorian house at 1426 F Street in Midtown Sacramento, which she had been renting since 1968, and where the parole system knew she lived. The neighborhood itself was part of the cover. Midtown Sacramento in the 1980s was a district of large old houses subdivided into rooms, close to the state capitol and to the shelters and services that clustered near it. Boarding houses of that type were an ordinary feature of the area, and their populations turned over constantly. A tenant who was there in spring and gone by autumn was the norm rather than the exception, and nobody on the block would have been able to say with any confidence who was currently living at any given address. The house was a boarding house, and what Sacramento Social Services understood it to be is the reason it operated for years. By the mid-1980s, the city had a persistent population of people who could not live alone and had nowhere institutional to go. Deinstitutionalization had emptied California's state mental hospitals across the previous 2 decades without building the community housing that had been promised to replace them, and the result was a large number of adults with psychiatric illness, alcoholism, developmental disability, and chronic health problems living on federal disability and Social Security benefits, and a chronic shortage of anybody willing to take them in. Dorothea Puente was willing. Social workers, parole officers, and hospital discharge planners across Sacramento sent people to her, and she took the ones nobody else would take. She fed them well. She kept the house clean. She dealt with their paperwork. She was known in the neighborhood as a small, polite, elderly-looking woman who wore floral dresses and old-fashioned glasses, gave money to Hispanic community causes, took food to homeless people on the street, and kept a garden on the F Street lot that people stopped to look at. The property was on the tour circuit of local gardeners. The benefit checks are the motive, and there is nothing more complicated underneath it. Each tenant in that house represented a monthly federal payment. Social Security, supplemental security income, and veterans benefits arrived by mail, and Puente took control of them, cashed them, gave the tenant a small allowance, and kept the rest. That worked while the tenant was alive, and it continued to work after the tenant was dead for as long as the death was not reported, and she was skilled enough with a signature and a story to keep several of those running at once. She was also handy. There was always work being done at 1426 F Street. Neighbors saw men hired to dig and to pour concrete in the yard and thought nothing of it, because a woman who gardened obsessively having holes dug in her garden is not an event. Ruth Monroe was a friend and business partner who moved into the house in April 1982. She became ill and died of an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. The Sacramento County coroner ruled it a suicide. Puente was arrested weeks later on the drugging and robbery charges that sent her to prison, and Monroe's death sat as a closed file for 6 years. Everson Gilmuth was a 77-year-old man from Oregon who came to Sacramento in 1985 to marry her. He arrived in November. In January 1986, a fisherman found a wooden box in the Sacramento River near Sutter County containing the remains of an elderly man. Nobody could identify him, and he went into the record as unknown. Puente continued cashing Gilmuth's pension checks and writing letters to his relatives in his voice for the next 3 years. The tenant who ended it was Alvaro Montoya, known as Bert, a 51-year-old Costa Rican man with schizophrenia and a developmental disability who had lived on the streets before being placed at F Street. He was gentle, well known at the local shelter, and closely followed by a social worker named Judy Moyse, who had spent years working with him and who visited. Montoya stopped being there in the early part of 1988. Puente told Moyse he had gone to Mexico with a relative. She produced a brother-in-law who telephoned to confirm it, who turned out to be a tenant she had put up to it. Moyse did not believe any of it and kept pushing, and in November 1988, she filed a missing person report and made sure it reached somebody who would act. Detective John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department went to 1426 F Street on November 11, 1988, with a small team, and Puente let them in and was helpful. They asked about the yard. She gave permission to dig. In the afternoon, they opened ground near a small shrine, and a young officer's shovel brought up a bone. What happened the next day is the part everybody remembers. Puente was not under arrest. There was, at that point, one set of remains and no evidence tying her to it directly. She approached Cabrera on the morning of November 12, asked whether she was under arrest, was told she was not, and asked whether she might walk down to the Clarion Hotel for a cup of coffee. He walked her part way. She never came back. A bus and then a taxi took her to Los Angeles, and she checked into a motel in the Skid Row area. On the evening of November 16, she was drinking in a bar on 3rd Street and struck up a conversation with a 78-year-old retired carpenter named Charles Wilgoose. She told him her name was Donna Johansson, asked about his pension, and suggested they might live together and share expenses. Wilgoose went home, could not shake the feeling that he had seen her before, connected her to the woman on the national news, and telephoned the CBS station in Los Angeles rather than the police. A producer confirmed it. Puente was arrested at the motel that night. 7 bodies came out of the yard at 1426 F Street. They were Alvaro Montoya, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, Betty Palmer, Leona Carpenter, James Gallup, and Vera Faye Martin. Betty Palmer's remains were missing the head, hands, and lower legs, which have never been found. Everson Gilmuth was subsequently identified as the man in the box in the river, and Ruth Munroe's 1982 death was re-examined. The total attributed to her is 9. The people in the yard were not anonymous drifters, which is how the case is often summarized. Dorothy Miller was in her 60s. Benjamin Fink was in his 50s and an alcoholic. Leona Carpenter was 78 and had been discharged from hospital into the house. Betty Palmer was 78. James Gallup was 62 and had recently had surgery. Vera Faye Martin was 64. Every one of them had a name, an address on F Street, and a monthly payment arriving in the mail. Toxicology found the sedative flurazepam in the remains, which was the drug she had been convicted of using on the 4 victims in 1982. The bodies were too decomposed for any of them to yield a definitive cause of death, and that became the central problem at trial. Sacramento has never fully accounted for the parole failure. Dorothea Puente was released in 1985 under conditions that named the exact conduct she immediately resumed, and she resumed it at the address her parole officer had on file. She was visited, the house was known. What was not known, and what nobody had built a mechanism to know, was that the people living in it were on federal benefit rolls whose payments were being redirected, because the parole system, the Social Security Administration, County Social Services, and the Police Department each held one piece of that and had no reason or route to compare it. The county was also, in the plainest terms, referring business to her. Discharge planners and caseworkers with a client nobody would house sent that client to F Street and were relieved when she said yes. Several of those workers were later interviewed and described a woman who was reliable, who answered the phone, who reported problems, and who made their caseloads manageable. That is the position she had built for herself, and it is why the reports that tenants had gone missing were absorbed rather than acted on for years before Judy Moyse refused to absorb one. The excavation in November 1988 became a national event within 48 hours. Television trucks parked on F Street. The digging went on for days as bodies came up one after another, in front of cameras, while the woman responsible was unaccounted for, and the police department had to explain publicly why it had let her walk to a coffee shop. The 4 days between her leaving and her arrest in Los Angeles produced sightings across the western United States, and a level of coverage that made her face one of the most recognizable in the country, which is ultimately what caused Charles Wilkes to place the call that ended it. The prosecution then had to convert all of that into a case that could survive a courtroom, and the physical evidence was thin in exactly the way that mattered. The trial was moved to Monterey County on a change of venue and ran from February to August 1993, one of the longest and most expensive proceedings in California history to that point, with more than 150 witnesses. The defense argument was that all 9 had died of natural causes in a house full of elderly, alcoholic, and chronically ill people, and that Dorothea Puente had buried them in the yard out of greed rather than killing them, in order to keep collecting the checks. That is not as weak an argument as it sounds, and the jury took a month to deliberate. On August 26, 1993, she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink and Leona Carpenter. The jury deadlocked on the remaining 6 counts and again on the penalty. In December 1993, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence was served at the Central California Women's Facility at Chowchilla, where she corresponded extensively, contributed to a cookbook, and maintained her innocence. She died there on March 27, 2011, at 82. The house on F Street still stands and has been sold and renovated. For several years, it was the site of an annual event held by the current owners. The people in the yard had almost all been placed there by an agency. Every one of them had a case file somewhere in Sacramento County. What they did not have was anybody who would notice within a reasonable period that they had stopped existing, which is precisely why they were sent to a boarding house on F Street in the first place, and which is precisely what she was selecting for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. A year after that garden was opened, men began turning up dead along the highways of Central Florida, shot with the same small caliber pistol, and left in the woods off the road. Their cars were recovered miles from the bodies, in different counties. For most of a year, 5 separate sheriff's offices were looking for a man. Section 9. Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, to a 15-year-old mother and a father she never met. Leo Dale Pittman was a diagnosed schizophrenic and a convicted child molester who hanged himself in a Kansas prison cell in 1969. Her mother, Diane, left both children with her own parents in 1960 and did not come back. Lori and Britta Wuornos legally adopted Aileen and her brother Keith and raised them believing they were their parents, and Aileen found out otherwise from other children. The household was violent. Her grandfather drank and beat her, and she said afterward that she was made to strip for punishment. By 11, she was trading sex acts with local boys for cigarettes and small change. At 14, she became pregnant, and the family sent her to a home for unwed mothers in Detroit, where she gave birth in March 1971 to a boy who was placed for adoption immediately. Her grandmother died of liver failure 4 months later. Her grandfather threw her out. She was 15, and from that point she lived outdoors, in the woods near the house, and then on the road. The next 15 years are a record of hitchhiking, prostitution along interstate highways, petty theft, forged checks, armed robbery, drinking, and arrests in several states under several names. In 1976, she married a 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Gratz Fell in Florida, and the marriage was annulled after 9 weeks after she assaulted him with his own cane. She attempted suicide more than once. Her brother Keith died of cancer in 1976, and she used the insurance money in a matter of weeks. In 1986, she met Tyria Moore, a hotel maid, at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. The relationship lasted about 4.5 years and was the only stable attachment of her adult life. The two of them lived in motels, storage sheds, and rented rooms across Central Florida, and Wuornos supported both of them by working the truck stops and highway ramps along Interstate 4 and Interstate 75. That work is the context for everything that followed. A woman working highway prostitution in Florida in the 1980s was doing it alone, in a stranger's vehicle, at a location chosen by the stranger, off the road and out of sight, with no way to call anyone, and no expectation of being believed if something went wrong. Assaults against women in that trade were common and almost never prosecuted, in part because reporting one meant admitting to a crime, and in part because law enforcement of that period frequently did not treat those complaints as complaints. Wuornos had made such a report herself in the past. Nothing came of it. The geography matters to how long it took. Central Florida in that period was crossed by 2 interstates and a network of state roads running through pine and scrub, with long stretches between exits and unpaved logging tracks leading off them within a few hundred yards of the highway. A body left in that terrain might be found in 3 days or 3 months, depending entirely on who happened to walk into it, and the vehicles were being abandoned in different counties from the bodies. The sequence in which the victims were discovered bore almost no relation to the sequence in which they were killed, which made building any timeline slow. The killings ran from late 1989 to late 1990, and all 7 followed a similar shape. Richard Mallory was 51, ran an electronics repair business in Clearwater, and disappeared on November 30th, 1989. His car was found abandoned. His body was found on December 13th, in woods off Interstate 95 in Volusia County, with 3, 22, caliber bullets in the chest. David Spears was 43, a construction worker from Sarasota, last seen on May 19, 1990. His body was found on June 1, off State Road 19 in Citrus County, naked, shot 6 times with a .22. Charles Carskadden was 40, a rodeo worker, found on June 6, 1990, in Pasco County, under a piece of carpet, shot 9 times. Peter Seams was 65, a retired merchant seaman from Jupiter, Florida, who left on June 7, 1990, to drive to Arkansas and was never found. His body has never been recovered. What was found was his Pontiac Sunbird, crashed and abandoned near Orange Springs on July 4, 1990. Witnesses saw 2 women leave the car and walk away, and one of them was bleeding from the arm. Those witnesses gave descriptions to a police artist, and those 2 sketches, published statewide, are the reason the case broke. Troy Burress was 50, a sausage delivery driver, reported missing on July 30, 1990, and found on August 4 in a wooded area in Marion County, shot twice. Charles Richard Humphreys was 56, a former Alabama police chief working as a child abuse investigator for the state of Florida, found on September 12, 1990, in Marion County, fully clothed, shot 7 times. His car was found in Suwannee County. Walter Geno Antonio was 62, a truck driver and a reserve police officer, found on November 19, 1990, near a logging road in Dixie County, nearly naked, shot 4 times. Investigators in 5 Florida counties were working these cases separately for months before anyone connected them. What connected them was the .22 caliber, the abandoned vehicles, and eventually the 2 composite sketches. In January 1991, fingerprints from the Seams vehicle and from a pawn shop transaction matched a woman with a long Florida arrest record under multiple aliases. Florida law required pawnbrokers to take a thumbprint, and Warnos had pawned property belonging to Richard Mallory and David Spears. The investigation that found her was assembled out of nothing. 7 bodies had been left across Volusia, Citrus, Pasco, Marion and Dixie counties, and Florida in 1990 had no statewide mechanism that would automatically compare a shooting in one county with a shooting in another. Each sheriff's office opened its own file. The connection was made informally by investigators who talked to each other and formalized into a multi-agency task force built around the Marion County Sheriff's Office and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. What that task force had for most of a year was a series of middle-aged men found off the road with 22 wounds, missing vehicles, and no witnesses. The working assumption in the press and inside the investigation was that they were looking for a man, because the overwhelming majority of highway killings of that type are committed by men, and because nothing in the physical evidence suggested otherwise. The 2 composite sketches from the Orange Springs crash changed that, and they only existed because Peter Seams's car had been driven into a fence in front of people. The arrest came on January 9, 1991, at a biker bar called The Last Resort in Port Orange, on an outstanding warrant, so that investigators could hold her while they located Tyria Moore. Moore was found in Pennsylvania. She agreed to cooperate and was placed in a Daytona Beach motel room, from which she made a series of recorded telephone calls to Warnos in the county jail, telling her that the police were pressuring her family and that she was frightened. Over 3 days of those calls, Warnos moved toward taking sole responsibility, and on January 16, 1991, she gave a 3-hour videotaped confession to the killings, insisting throughout that every one of them had been a client who had attacked her and that she had shot in self-defense. The self-defense claim is the entire argument about this case, and it has to be handled honestly, because both the strong and the weak version of it get repeated as though they were settled. Tyria Moore was never charged with anything. She had been living with Warnos throughout the killings, had been in Peter Seams's car when it was crashed at Orange Springs, and had handled property taken from the dead men. What she gave investigators in exchange for that position was the recorded telephone calls and her testimony, and the defense attacked her on exactly those terms at every trial, arguing that a witness working off her own exposure will say what the people holding it want to hear. The jury in the Mallory case heard that argument and convicted in under 2 hours. Moore returned to Pennsylvania afterward and has spoken publicly about the case only rarely. The first trial, for the murder of Richard Mallory, was held in Volusia County in January 1992. Judge Uriel Blount permitted the state to introduce evidence of the other killings under a Florida rule allowing similar fact evidence to show pattern, which meant a jury deciding one homicide heard about 7. The defense put her on the stand, and she testified that Mallory had bound her, assaulted her, and threatened to kill her. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and convicted her on January 27, 1992. She was sentenced to death on January 31st. Some months later, an investigative team working for Dateline NBC established through Maryland records that Richard Mallory had served 10 years in a Maryland prison for violent attempted rape. That record existed and was findable, and the jury never heard it. Her appellate lawyers argued it went directly to the credibility of the account she had given from the witness stand. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed the issue and upheld the conviction, taking the view that it would not have changed the outcome given the other 6 killings. The case then produced a scandal of its own. Within weeks of the arrest, 3 investigators from the Marion County Sheriff's Office and 1 from another agency were found to have been in discussions about selling film and book rights to the story while the prosecution was still being prepared. It became the subject of internal investigations, a state inquiry, and a great deal of defense litigation, and it was raised repeatedly on appeal as evidence that the people building the case had a financial stake in how it was told. Tyria Moore was also approached about media arrangements. None of that changed the outcome of any trial, and all of it is part of the record. In the remaining cases, she pleaded no contest or guilty rather than stand trial, telling one court that she wanted to get right with God and that she had killed them for money as well. She received 6 death sentences in total. No charge was brought over Peter Seams because his body was never found. For the following decade, she gave interviews, wrote letters, and changed her account repeatedly. In some, she was a rape victim who fought back. In others, she said she had robbed and killed them and would do it again. She was adopted as an adult by a woman named Arlene Prowl, who said she had been instructed by God to do it, an arrangement that drew heavy criticism at the time. Nick Broomfield made 2 documentaries about the case, the second of which recorded her final interview and includes her describing sonic pressure being applied to her cell. In 2001, she wrote to the Florida Supreme Court asking to dismiss her remaining appeals, saying she had killed in cold blood and would kill again and wanted the process over. 3 psychiatrists examined her and found her competent to make that choice, an assessment that has been contested by mental health professionals since. Governor Jeb Bush ordered a further evaluation, which reached the same conclusion. The competency question has never settled. The evaluations that cleared her to drop her appeals were conducted in a short window and reached their conclusion quickly, and mental health professionals who have reviewed the case since have pointed to a documented history of severe trauma, chronic alcohol use, and disordered thinking that was visible in the recordings made in her final years. She had also spent a decade being interviewed by people who wanted a version of her, and she supplied a different one to almost every one of them. The execution took place by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 9, 2002. She declined a last meal and took a cup of coffee. Her final statement referred to sailing with the Rock and being back like Independence Day, with the film about a mothership. She was 46. The cultural weight of this case is out of proportion to everything around it. She has been described relentlessly as America's first female serial killer, which is false, and was false when it was first printed, as the previous 8 sections of this video demonstrate. What she actually was, and what made her unusual, is a woman who killed adult male strangers with a firearm at the roadside. Almost every other woman in this list killed people who trusted her, in a house with a substance. That difference is why she became the template, and why the 2003 film Monster, which won Charlize Theron an Academy Award, is the version most people carry. The 7 men have been comprehensively flattened by that. Troy Burress had a wife and 2 children and was delivering sausage. Dick Humphreys had spent 35 years in law enforcement and had just been reassigned. His wife found out on their 35th wedding anniversary. Peter Seams was a retired seaman who did missionary work and whose family have never had a body. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this one, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel more than you'd think. 4 years into that Florida death row sentence, on a ward at a veterans hospital in western Massachusetts, 3 nurses started keeping a private count. They had noticed that men were arresting on one particular shift, that the epinephrine ampules were disappearing, and that the nurse who found them was always the one who ran the code. Section 10, Kristen Gilbert, Fall River, Massachusetts, in November 1967, is where Kristen Heather Strickland was born. and she grew up in Groton in a middle-class household. She was academically strong and was accepted into an accelerated program at Bridgewater State College, completing a nursing degree in 1988. She married Glenn Gilbert in 1988, and they had 2 sons. In March 1989, at 21, she was hired at the Edward P. Boland Veterans Affairs Medical Center in the Leeds section of Northampton, Massachusetts, and assigned to Ward C. Colleagues from her early years there described a nurse who was fast, confident, and technically excellent, particularly in an emergency. She was the person other nurses wanted on the floor when something went wrong, and she was known for spotting deterioration early and running a resuscitation calmly. She was popular, sociable, and funny. Several of the people who eventually testified against her had been her friends. The ward she worked on is central to how this happened. A Veterans Affairs medical center in a small New England city is not an acute trauma hospital. Ward C held long-stay male patients, many of them elderly veterans of the Second World War and Korea, many with chronic heart, lung, kidney, or neurological disease, some with severe alcohol-related illness, and a substantial number with no family visiting. When a 70-year-old man with a documented cardiac history dies on a medical ward at 3 in the morning, no institution anywhere in the world investigates it. That is the expected outcome of the admission. Ward C also ran on a rhythm that removed most of the people who might have noticed. Visiting was limited, and many of the patients had nobody visiting at all. Physicians rounded during the day and were reachable by telephone at night. The evening and overnight shifts were staffed thinly, which meant a nurse alone with a patient in a side room was an unremarkable situation for extended periods. Epinephrine is the drug at the center of this case, and it needs to be explained properly, because it is the reverse of what most poisoners use. Epinephrine is adrenaline. It is the drug given during cardiac arrest to restart a heart, and it sits on every crash cart in every hospital in the country in 1 milligram ampules. Nobody counts it the way controlled substances are counted because it is not a narcotic and there is no street value in it, and nobody had any reason to think about what it could do in the opposite direction. Given to a person whose heart is beating normally, a large dose of epinephrine drives the heart rate and blood pressure up violently and can throw the heart into a fatal rhythm. In a patient with existing cardiac disease, it produces exactly the event that patient was always expected to have eventually. The drug is metabolized by the body within minutes and, at the time, was not something a post-mortem examination would look for or find. A physician arriving at the bedside sees a man with heart disease who has had a cardiac arrest. There is no chemical left to argue with. The pattern on Ward C between 1995 and 1996 was that cardiac arrests happened during the evening shift Kristen Gilbert worked, at a rate the other nurses could not explain. The unit went from a handful of deaths a year to a figure several times that. Gilbert was almost always the one who discovered the patient, and she called the codes and she ran them, and she was good at it. The staff worked it out before the institution did. 3 nurses in particular, including Kathy Ricks and Renee Walsh, began paying attention, and what they eventually did was count. They tracked which shifts the arrests occurred on. They noticed that ampules of epinephrine were disappearing from the supply, and that the log did not account for them, and that vials were being found emptied. They noticed that patients who arrested were frequently ones Gilbert had been alone with. They took what they had to their supervisors in early 1996. What the 3 nurses did carried an obvious cost. They were accusing a colleague, a friend in some cases, of murdering patients, on the basis of dates written on paper and missing ampules, with no confession and no body that looked wrong. If they were mistaken, they would have ended their own careers and destroyed hers. They went anyway, and every subsequent account of the case identifies that decision as the only thing that stopped it. The hospital moved. The Veterans Affairs Inspector General was brought in, and because the facility is federal property, the case went to federal investigators and eventually to the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Gilbert took a leave of absence in February 1996 and resigned that August. What she did next made the case considerably easier to prove. She had been involved with James Perot, a Veterans Affairs police officer at the hospital, and the relationship had broken down as the investigation closed in. In September 1996, while a federal grand jury was sitting, she telephoned in a bomb threat to the hospital. It was traced. She was convicted of that offense in 1998 and sentenced to 15 months, and it put her in custody while the homicide investigation continued. Perot, who had been a supporter, subsequently gave evidence that she had made statements to him amounting to an admission. The bodies were exhumed. Toxicological analysis established elevated epinephrine in tissue in a way that could not be explained by resuscitation efforts alone, and the government also built a statistical case, presenting an expert analysis showing that the concentration of deaths and cardiac emergencies on her shifts was far beyond anything chance would produce. The defense fought both, arguing that epinephrine findings after a full resuscitation prove nothing, because resuscitation involves giving epinephrine, and arguing that shift-based statistics can be constructed to incriminate anyone. The federal death penalty question in this case created a situation that Massachusetts had not seen in decades. The state had not executed anyone since 1947 and had abolished capital punishment in practice long before, and public opinion in western Massachusetts reflected that. Because the Boland Center is federal property, the crimes fell under federal jurisdiction, and the United States Attorney's Office was entitled to seek death, and it chose to. That decision was contested publicly throughout, and jury selection took a long time precisely because a large proportion of the pool in Hampden and Hampshire counties said plainly that they would not impose it. The case also sits inside a body of research that barely existed when it was tried. Healthcare killings of this type share a set of features that investigators now look for as a matter of routine, which are an unexplained rise in mortality or emergencies confined to one unit and one shift, a staff member repeatedly present at the onset, that staff member frequently being the one to discover the patient and to lead the response, supply discrepancies in a drug that is not otherwise controlled, and colleagues who have privately drawn conclusions long before anybody in management has. Every one of those was present on Ward C, and every one of them had been present in San Antonio 14 years earlier. The evidence problem was that none of those features is proof of anything on its own. A nurse who is good in an emergency will be present at emergencies. A nurse who works a busy shift will be present when patients die on it. The government's case had to establish that the pattern was too extreme to be explained that way, and that the epinephrine findings were not the residue of treatment, and the defense spent 3 months arguing exactly that. The trial began in United States District Court in Springfield, Massachusetts, in November 2000, and ran for 3 months before Judge Michael Ponsor. Because the deaths occurred on federal property, the case was federal, which is why it carried a possible death sentence in a state that had abolished capital punishment. On March 14, 2001, the jury convicted Kristen Gilbert of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The murders were of Stanley Jagodowski, 66, Henry Hudon, 35, and Kenneth Cutting, 41, who was blind and had multiple sclerosis. The attempted murders were of Angelo Vella and Thomas Callahan, both of whom survived. She was acquitted on 1 count relating to a 4th patient. The penalty phase followed immediately. The government sought death. The jury deliberated and could not reach unanimity, with reports afterward indicating that some jurors weighed the impact on her 2 young sons. On March 26, 2001, Judge Ponsor sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years. She is held at the Federal Medical Center in Carswell, Texas. The motive presented at trial was attention. The prosecution argued that she induced the emergencies in order to be the nurse who found them and ran them, and specifically in order to be at the hospital and visible to James Perot, who worked nights and who responded to codes. There is no financial motive in this case at all, and that is one of the things that has kept it in the literature. The number is unresolved. Investigators examined a period during which Ward C recorded around 350 deaths, of which somewhere in the region of 80 occurred during Gilbert's employment on her shifts, and public estimates of how many she may have been responsible for have run as high as 40. 3 were proven. The remainder are men who died on a veterans ward, with a heart condition and a chart that says so, and there is no method available now that would separate them. What the case actually established is closer to a warning about counting. Kristen Gilbert was caught because nurses on a ward started writing dates down. There was no forensic tell, no witness, no confession, and no missing money. The only thing that was ever visibly wrong was a number, and the only people positioned to see the number were the people standing in it, working alongside her, most of whom liked her, and none of whom had any procedure to follow when they realized what they were looking at. Health systems in the United States and elsewhere have since built formal mortality surveillance and reporting mechanisms partly on the back of this case and the ones like it, and the reason those systems exist is that in every single one of them, from Bexar County in 1982 to to Northampton in 1996, the frontline staff knew first and had no route to say so that anyone was required to act on. Stanley Jagodowski was a veteran in his 60s who had come in with a routine problem. Henry Hudon was 35. Kenneth Cutting was 41, blind, and his wife had been told he was stable. All three had been admitted to a hospital run by the government they had served, on a ward where the person most likely to save them was the person who was killing them. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.